Hey guys, Mike in the Woods here. So recently, as you might have seen, I went on a winter backpacking trip. If you haven't watched the video, I'll link it up at the top of the screen. Didn't have any significant problems. A few minor things that I can learn from for next time, but overall, a lot of lessons that I learned in previous trips really came in handy for this one. But even so, I think it's important to take a look, do an after-action report, and just think about what went right and what went well, and just reflect on what happened in that trip and anything I can apply to the next one. So subscribe if you're new to the channel, and let's take a look. So one thing I'm noticing is that I almost never seem to use any sort of shelter when I'm out camping during the winter. Out of the last, I think 4 or 5 trips I've been on, I think I've only used shelter once. And that was when I did my solo stealth overnighter. I had my tarp set up. It's getting to the point where I'm considering taking out my big AquaQuest tarp from the pack, taking out my hammock from the pack, and only having my rain poncho. It's one of those ones that clamps down the sides and you can unbutton it and it turns into a big tarp that you can use for shelter. I got a big massive 10x10 tarp in my hammock, which includes all of the metal carabiners and stuff that go with that. So if I'm not using it, I might try a couple trips where I don't bring it with me, because 9 times out of 10 I just always seem to cowboy camp. So aside from that, I'm actually really starting to like the kit that I have put together for winter use. If you haven't watched my teardown, I'll link it up at the top of the screen. Just keep in mind things have changed a little bit since then. And that's for my kit that goes down to an absolute bare bottom minimum of -20. On that last trip that I just went on the first night, it got down to -17 degrees Celsius, which is pretty close to the absolute bare bottom minimum of what that kit's supposed to handle. And I did all right. It was a little chilly, but I managed to sleep through the night okay, and I wasn't too destroyed in the morning. Like I've talked about in my previous after-action reports, I'm finding that the biggest consideration is wind. If you can block out the wind, you can get by with a lot less for insulation, as opposed to if you just decided to let the wind blast you all night. It's always good to keep taking a look at what you can cut, what you can swap out for a lighter version. Fully loaded, it's at about somewhere around 37 pounds. I haven't weighed it in its current configuration, but it could definitely stand to lose a few more pounds and get a bit lighter. Now, keeping in mind, that is a winter kit meant for heavy duty -20 degrees overnight camping. So if we want to talk about individual pieces of kit that I've really started to be able to test out, that 3-liter titanium pot that I've been using for boiling snow and cooking food, I was a little bit hesitant on it at first because I thought it might have been too big, but it's turning out that I really love having that big of a pot out in the backcountry. And because it's titanium, it's actually super light, so it doesn't take up a lot of weight. It is big, it takes up a lot of space, but currently that's where I keep my hammock. It really makes using snow for drinking water or for cooking a really viable option, because if you've tried to boil snow before, you know that even if you pack down the snow as tight as it'll go, you wind up with maybe a quarter of the pot worth of water, maybe less depending on the density of the snow. By having a big 3-liter pot, if I pack that thing full of snow and put it on the fire, I wind up with just enough to cook up one of those Leatherman Sidekick meals and make a coffee. I think it's the perfect size, and I'm gonna probably keep it as it is. As for actual lessons learned, I didn't necessarily have a huge problem because of it, but it was definitely something that I definitely want to keep in mind for future trips, is how much the state and depth of the snow affects your hike. Obviously, the deeper the snow, the more of a pain in the ass it is to hike through it, but it's also the type of snow, right? Is it like a soft, fresh, cold, powdery snow? Is it packing snow? Is it semi-melted snow that's refrozen? The type of snow has a huge impact on your hiking experience. So if it's the type that's mostly melted and then refrozen, that's really easy to slip on, and you surprisingly have to slow down, right? Because if you take one wrong step and you're not wearing micro spikes, you're gonna hurt yourself. If you're deep in the backcountry and you slip and pull something, you're kind of screwed. So you really got to take your time and be careful if you're in icy conditions like that. If it's super soft and powdery snow, your feet are trudging through that, kicking out of the way with every step. That's the type that I had to deal with on the hike into this particular camp trip, and that was a pain in the butt. That made what was only a 7-kilometer hike, I swear that felt like 3 times the distance that we actually hiked. Just from having that much soft snow that my boot was sinking through. And we got lucky. The actual snow depth was well up past our knees, but on that backcountry trail, it's like a snowmobile trail, some sort of truck had been down that in, I don't know, like a week beforehand and left ruts in the snow so that we had somewhere that wasn't as deep that we could walk through, but there was still a bit of snow accumulation in there. And just that little bit of snow accumulation just made it so much harder to hike through. And we didn't even wind up making it to where we wanted to set up camp. The total hike was supposed to be around 10 kilometers, but we wound up stopping at the 7-kilometer mark. So we have that main snowmobile trail, and then there's a part where you have to pull off onto a hiking trail, and nobody had been down that trail in quite some time, so the snow was like basically undisturbed. Knee-high, soft and powdery, really dense, and when you're post-holing like that, you do not want to do crazy distances. I think we made it a grand total of like 400, 500 meters in that before all of us said, screw it, we're gonna set up camp somewhere around here. Unfortunately, I haven't purchased snowshoes yet, and just to illustrate how much of a difference the snow makes on your hike, by the time we hiked out, some snowmobiles had been down it the night before we hiked out, and that compacted the snow. Combine that with the fact that the second day and the third day were really warm, above 0 degrees, and it started to melt the snow and make it more like packing snow, and it started to crust over on the top that had been compacted down. That made the hike out so much easier than the hike in. If I had to say one thing I wish I brought with me on this trip that I didn't have, it would definitely have been snowshoes. Got my eye on a pair, but they're like 350 bucks. The other weather-related thing, and I just touched on that a little bit, is how crazy the temperature swings were. First night, it got down to minus 17 degrees Celsius. It had warmed up a little bit by the time I actually got up and out of my sleeping bag, but usually at around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, that's when the temperature bottoms out overnight. That's when it's the coldest out. Throughout the second day, it must have reached 2-3 degrees Celsius. So that's a 20 degrees Celsius temperature difference in less than 24 hours. That's some crazy swings, man. I go from having to wear my ski mask and all my layers the night before to walking around with just my base layer top on the next day. It's not just your layering that gets affected by that either. So, like I mentioned, it started to affect the snow. The snow turned from the soft, cold, fresh type to dense packing snow. And because you have to take off all those layers have to go somewhere. So that's why you need to make sure you have somewhere on your kit to put your extra layers that you tear off. You don't want to be hand carrying all those things out when you're trying to hike out of a backcountry campsite. So have space in your pack or on the outside, like what I do, to make sure that you can delayer and have somewhere to put everything. And those temperature swings are also why it's important to make sure you know what the bare bottom minimum of your particular loadout is capable of handling, and to make sure that the weather is not going to exceed that. The kit that I brought with me, I had tested and verified that I was good down to minus 20 degrees Celsius base temperature. The week before, it looked like it was only going to get down to minus 10 degrees, but on the night before, that temperature on the first night had dropped all the way down to minus 17 degrees Celsius. But you always need to monitor and make sure and be ready that if that temperature is going to go lower than what you think, you want to make sure that you bring stuff for an even lower temperature. And one of the other lessons learned actually was not at my own expense. It was at one of the other guys that was out there with us. Right before our trip, he decided to try a new footwear configuration. He had a pair of rubber boots. I'm not sure if he's used them before. I think he has. But he also decided to try them with a different set of insoles that he's never used with them before. And anyone who's gone on a lot of hikes or backcountry camping or that sort of thing can agree with me on this one. You don't want to try new footwear configurations prior to a big hike like that. He wound up with some pretty bad blisters the whole weekend, and it must have been a really miserable trip for him. He got hot spots and blisters on the hike in, and he had to deal with that the entire weekend, and then he had to hike out as well. The moral of that story is always break in and get used to a particular set of footwear and insole and whatever else you might have going on in there before you go on a big hike like that. I'm pretty sure he knew not to do that too, but I think it's just one of those things, like you just overlook it. You're like, what's the worst that could happen? And it comes and bites you in the butt because you neglected it. In addition to learning all these lessons, it's important that you keep them in mind and keep applying them, because when you start getting negligent like that, that's when stuff starts to go wrong. But aside from that, I had a really fun trip. Yeah, that's about it for this after action report on that trip. Like I said, if you haven't seen that trip, go check it out because I really had a lot of fun on that trip, and it was probably one of my best winter camping trips to date. If for whatever reason you're new to this channel, I take a look at how fun, futuristic technology can intersect with traditional outdoors experiences. Check out my other videos and consider subscribing if that's your thing. If you're interested in the gear that I use for winter camping, I'll leave Amazon affiliate links in the description down below. That's all for now. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you next time.